I'm privileged to be on the panel today and thankful for the invitation. I'm happy to have my colleague and friend Donna Smith here. Donna and I have been attached to the hip on a couple of projects here lately, and pleased to meet Tracy Russell and her colleague Rosie Silliboy. It's really nice that you're here today too, from Maui Dunk.
Yes.
So, before I begin my comments, to talk a little bit about this intersection of disability in the African Nova Scotian community, I wanted to tell a brief story. So, this happened many years ago, probably in the early 90s when I was working here. In fact, I started my career in 1989, not 1999. So you just do the math and add 10 years to however old you thought I was, and you're getting close. Years ago, a colleague of mine, an African Nova Scotian woman, has two very small children, 6 and 8, maybe her kids were at the time. And they were both musically inclined. And you know, when your kids are in music classes, they go to recitals all the time. You know, the music teachers are organizing these recitals. And on this one occasion, I was invited, myself, my ex-wife, and was invited by this colleague of mine to attend a musical recital, which was being held in a long-term care facility. And my friend's son, Calvin, a very precocious 6 or 7-year-old boy, he's kind of grumpily carrying his violin, his music case, I guess. I'm not sure what he was playing just now, but he's carrying his music, and he's kind of grumpily talking about, I always have to do these recitals, and he says, how come we always play in nursing homes, he says. You know, and he's just, mumbling to himself, and he's not very happy. And then he says, and how come there are never any black people in these places? To which his mother replies, just remember that, dear. Right? So this funny anecdote is a story that reflects some of the folklore about caregiving, aging, and disability within the African Nova Scotian community. The folklore is that black people take care of their own, from the cradle to the grave. Hence, not a great presence of us in nursing homes, or so was Calvin's observation. This folklore is built on the idea that African Nova Scotians have large and supportive extended families that are socialized to look after all of our possible needs across the lifespan, and that this creates little challenge for the lives of caregivers and results in a rich and happy life for those who are being cared for. At least that is the folklore. Okay? Though this is a positive stereotype that instills pride rather than brings shame to our status as African Nova Scotians, I'm not so sure if it's true, or that if African Nova Scotians are absent from caregiving institutions and formal support services, that the reason for this is because they're being well cared for at home. Okay? So I guess what I'm saying is I'd like to play with that folklore a little bit, because maybe it's not so, right? And I could talk about endless stories like that. You know, my mother has a cousin who's quite ill, and toward the end of her days, and my mother goes to the hospitals and sits with her and says things like, with the amount of family we have, why is she sitting alone? Right? It kind of puts it brings the whole folklore into question. This whole idea reminds me of another story. I remember that years ago, about 10 years after the development of a substance abuse treatment service for adolescents, Choices, I don't know if people would be familiar with Choices. About 10 years after its initial development, a social worker was going around in the black community asking some questions. And she came and interviewed me, and she said, why after 10 years of specialized services to adolescents have we not had one single referral of an African Nova Scotian youth to our services? 10 years after the establishment of a specialized treatment program for kids who are suffering from difficulties with addictions, not one African Nova Scotian. And my response was the obvious answer, of course, and that is that there are absolutely no African Nova Scotian youth in the province who have drug problems. Right? So I tell these two stories for two reasons, right? They highlight the question, what do we know about African Nova Scotians and their presence in the service delivery systems, right? That's the question that these stories highlight. And as stories, they also highlight the answer. And the answer is we don't know. Right? So it's one of the reasons I don't have a PowerPoint here today, because if there was information to share with you, then I would have charts and graphs and statistics and stories about African Nova Scotians living with disabilities in Nova Scotia and the services that they are receiving and their experience within those services. The reality is we don't have that data today. So rather than provide information in terms of what we know about African Nova Scotians and the intersection of African Nova Scotians living with disabilities, let me outline a couple of things that we suspect. Or rather, what I'd say, a couple of things, actually 4 things, that I am positing today are some significant considerations that we need to keep in mind as we begin to explore the intersection of African Nova Scotians and addictions. Okay? So, I always warn people at this part of the program that in the absence of concrete information, what you're being subjected to is Robert S. Wright propaganda. And since it's the best information in the room, you're going to have to accept it. So there you have it. So these offerings are intended to spark conversation and perhaps help identify areas for further future investigation. So number one. To investigate disability and the experience of persons living with disability within the we will first need to understand how people in the African Nova Scotian community define disability. Okay? We should not presume that our current understanding of what defines disability is consistent across cultures and experiences. Are you with me on that? Okay. For example, a learning disability that makes it challenging for a person to learn to read may not be a recognized disability in a community with a low literacy rate. Right? Does that make sense? Now, I'm not suggesting that African Nova Scotians experience a low literacy rate. I'm just making the analogy, right, that disability is defined within a cultural context. And so we're going to need to step away from what we think we know about disabilities and explore that from a more grounded perspective as we begin to explore the meaning of disability and the experience of African Nova Scotians living with disabilities in Nova Scotia. Okay? That's often the hardest thing for us to do, because essentially what I'm asking is to suspend all that we know as we begin this journey, right? When we talk about substance abuse and addictions, for example, we have tended to medicalize the unhealthy use of substances, right? And so our approach to addictions and addiction prevention is all about drug use and the harmful experience of using drugs. The trafficking in substances has tended to be criminalized and not addressed as a health concern. So we don't consider trafficking and the considerations around trafficking within the addictions treatment continuum of services. So what does that say, for example, about the services we provide to communities where trafficking is the larger social problem associated with drugs than addiction? again, just an example of how we need to rethink how we consider the issue as we move across cultures and experiences. These kinds of things may play out when considering disability in the African Nova Scotian community, but we should not assume that my premise is that we should not assume that the definitions and the experiences are the same. My second proposition for this afternoon is that though services for persons living with disability are not as rich and comprehensive as they should be, many such services do exist. Would you agree with that? There are some. They're not as rich as they should be. They're not as comprehensive as they should be, but they do exist. There are some, they do exist. We should consider who are the people being served by these services and these institutions, and ask them the question, who are you not serving? Okay? If we find that African Nova Scotians are not being served within our current service delivery continuum, we should ask, why not? This question should place a burden on the service delivery sector to self-examine their cultural competence and relevance to a diverse population, rather than place a burden of inquiry on the underserved population. Are you with me? Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. This idea, I should just credit, does not originate with me today. I mean, we just had a conversation recently with my colleague, Wanda Thomas-Bernard, in the room, and she made this point, and I'm highlighting it here in her absence. So I'll give her credit where credit is due. The idea being that we'll place the burden of inquiry on the service delivery sector and not on the underserved population. Okay? It's that whole blame the victim kind of thing that we want to avoid. The third premise, and I only have 4, is that though work has been done on the idea of cultural patterns of help-seeking behaviors, how is it that men look for help for things? And we've already, we men have already been chided today for the fact that we don't seek out help. Right? The only help that we might ask for is, would you nail the coffin, please? That's the typical kind of scenario for men. We don't ask for help, and because we don't like our bits to be touched. I think it was suggested, and I would like to. No, I won't. Anyway, I don't know how that transcribes, but anyway, now, let's settle down. So we do know something about cultural patterns of help-seeking behavior, and so we sometimes think that this is a cultural thing. I used to joke and say that back in the day, the only time a black person went south of Cogswell Street in Halifax was if they were in an ambulance, right? And that is really, these kinds of cultural patterns of movement and help-seeking may be understood by an examination of cultural help-seeking practices. But in my view, it may be better understood by understanding the reality of racism and systemic exclusion of people from certain places. Okay? So to say, for example, and the reason why it's difficult for me to do the translation into the disability sector is because we don't know yet. But one of the things we can say, for example, is back in the day, why is it that black people went to bars uptown and they didn't go to bars downtown? It wasn't because that was a cultural drink-seeking behavior that kept us out of the downtown. It was that we were not welcome downtown, right? And to this day, if on a summer day, you see an a black couple holding hands walking in downtown Halifax, you'll say, oh, there must be a cruise ship in town, right? right? Because black folk don't occupy that space because they do not believe it is a welcoming space for them. So what I'm suggesting is our absence from certain locations shouldn't just be chalked up to cultural help-seeking behaviors, but may be better explained by systemic and institutional racism that exists in our society. Now, in case that is offensive to you or comes to as a shock to you, the Black Report uncovered and formally documented systemic racism within the education system. It's there, it is alive, it is well, we're dealing with it. The Marshall Inquiry clearly articulated that its continued existence, systemic racism's continued existence in the criminal justice system, it's there, it's documented, we're dealing with it. We should expect systemic racism and institutional racism and systemic exclusion of peoples of African descent as we are framing up our considerations of how do we explore the experience of persons who are of African descent living with disabilities. We should expect it. And when we find it, we should not shame the people where we find it, right? It is in the ether, it is real, and we just deal with it. Does that make sense? Okay. I say, an investigation that starts with this premise is more likely to engage honest and open responses to any inquiry that we might make, right? The fourth and final premise, and how am I doing for time? I think I'm going to sit down in record time. So, to investigate disability in the African Nova Scotian community, this is number 4, is to invite a method of inquiry that is intersectional in its nature. Now, how many people here have heard about intersectionality? Just raise your hand if you had, okay? So, intersectionality. It's a feminist, some would say maybe an anti-oppressive, but certainly the feminists claim it. A feminist methodology, intersectionality explores the relationships among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relations and subject formations. In other words, when you're doing an intersectional study, you're looking at all of the complex facets of how people experience social relations. So it's not enough to say, let's talk about African Nova Scotians and disabilities. We have to talk about African Nova Scotian men and women and disabilities. And we have to talk about African Nova Scotian gay men, lesbian women, transgendered men, transgendered women, poor men, rich women. We have to think about the rich complexity that is the human experience within our African Nova Scotian and other communities as we begin this project, right? To study race and disability is not sufficient. What about gender, age, socioeconomic status, immigrant status, sexual orientation, rural and urban experience, right? Our questions about race and disability should not be an exercise in further marginalizing these other considerations, but should be a vehicle for liberating the discourse to be truly inclusive and sufficiently complex that the needs of all Nova Scotians living with disabilities can be better understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, you're still with me? Mm-hmm. Okay, this means yes, this means no. For those of you coming from a Presbyterian heritage, you know, who aren't used to making noise in the pew. So that's fine. I sang in a Presbyterian church choir for many years. Some of my best friends are Presbyterian. So these are my comments. My apologies if I've rambled somewhat in the sharing. It was an attempt to just begin to open up that conversation. I've offered my 4 premises for moving forward in our discussions and in our considerations of African Nova Scotians living with disabilities. Thank you.